Hello. February 15th is the ancient Roman festival of Lupercalia, the feast of the wolf gods, which is inspired by the story I'm just about to tell you. Long ago, in ancient times, along the banks of the river Tiber, there dwelt the village of Alba Longa, a small rural community, much dedicated to the growing of olives and the harvesting of grapes, the drinking of fine wines, the baking of great bread, a life of rural contentment and luxury. Under the leadership of old King Numitor, a wise, gentle man with the temperament and disposition of a farmer, not of a warrior or a monarch, which was much to the ire, to the wrath of his brother Amulius, who did indeed have the temperament of a warrior, and wondered why on earth the throne had gone to his placid, calm, dull-witted brother, who wanted to think of nothing more than next year's harvest. He could make a difference. He could take the throne and expand Alba Longa, make it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, instead of just some piddling little farming community. But no. Their father and the gods had seen fit to put his older brother in charge. He could, of course, murder him and take the throne. There were others who had done this in the past. But to spill the blood of your own kin is to risk the absolute wrath of the gods themselves. There are few things which the gods take more seriously than kinslaying. And so Amulius, for all of his fiery temperament, held his hand back. But he plotted and he planned and he thought. And one night, along with a company of heavily armed men of similar temperament to himself, they swept into Alba Longa and they took old Numitor and carted him off to a distant villa, and there placed him under house arrest. He could have his life of olive groves and grapevines, of drinking wine and baking bread, so long as he stayed put, and so long as no one ever tried to set him free and rally a cause around him. But Numitor wasn't the only problem, for Numitor had had a daughter, Rhea Silvia, who was just approaching the age of womanhood when men were beginning to inquire about her hand in marriage and look to the future prospects of children. In other words, heirs to the throne. So even if old Numitor died peacefully in his bed, if there were grandsons around, they could cause future trouble. And so Amulius came up with another plan to dispose of his niece, again without needing to shed her blood. He took her and packed her off to the temple of Vesta to become one of the virgin priestesses, there to stay until she was 40 years of old, if she lived that long, and, by the reckoning of people in that day and age, beyond the point of childbearing. Whether she wanted to be a priestess of Vesta or not is a whole other question, and not one that her uncle ever actually asked her. He, in the meantime, though he had never shed any blood of his family, was more than happy to shed rivers of blood of all of the neighbouring tribes as he conquered downriver and upriver, taking over left and right and centre, expanding and expanding and expanding Alba Longa into ever greater territories to create, instead of a little rural village, a kingdom with himself as the king. He felt that the gods had blessed his enterprise. He was successful in battle, after all. The gods, however, were of a different mind. One god in particular, Mars, who, whilst these days we may think of him as a god of warfare and soldiers, in ancient times was primarily a god of agriculture and a god of the fields. His sympathy lay with old Numitor, not with the militant Amulius. And so, to ensure that things did not go Amulius's way, Mars descended from the heavens, in what form we do not know, but to earth he came, and there he went to the temple of Vesta, maybe with her permission, maybe without, but he slipped into the temple of Vesta, past all of the heavily armed guards outside it, past the various priestesses within, until he came to the cell in which Rhea Silvia, new-made priestess, was sleeping, and he lay with her. And very rapidly it began to show that she was pregnant and swelling. A huge scandal ensued, and in later times a priestess in her position would have been walled up alive. But as perhaps she was the first to whom this situation had befallen, they were kinder to her. They allowed the pregnancy to go full term, and she gave birth to not one but 2 children, 2 twin boys, a double blow, as far as her uncle was concerned. For Romulus knew the throne would only go to a male. There could be no queen. Had it been a daughter or 2 daughters, it would have been less of an issue. But because they were boys, it was a threat to his power. But again, he stayed his hand from the act of actually murdering them, but gave instructions to one of his henchmen to take a basket, place the 2 babies in the basket, take it down to the river Tiber and set it asail. If the basket sank and the babies drowned, or if the cold got to them and they died of exposure, well, the blood would be upon the hands of the river god, not upon the hands of Romulus. The job was done. The henchman set them sailing off until he lost sight of them in the distance, and went back to the new-made king to report all was right with the world. But Mars is not so easily thwarted. Up in Olympus he looked down and saw the plight of his children, and he blew the wind. He steered that basket on its course down the river until it washed up shore some miles down. There the twins emerged upon the muddy bank. Mars called into the woods, called to the grey shadows of the woods, the wolf pack that dwelt there, his loyal followers, for wolves are particularly sacred to Mars, and on came the wolf pack, looking slightly more intimidating than this, and came up to the babies and sniffed them in the leadership of Lupa, the she-wolf, head of the pack, along with her consort Lupercus. And whilst those who fear and hate wolves, of which there are far too many people in the world, will tell you the wolves would have fed upon those babies and devoured them, they did not. Instead, they took them by the scruff of their neck and carried them ever so gently back to the cave in which the wolf pack slept, the cave of the Lupercalia. And there, Lupa, with her own teats, suckled them, nurtured them on her own milk, and for year after year, with the whole pack rallying around to feed them, and once they matured from drinking milk, to feed them the meat that they found, raw meat of course. They nurtured those 2 young boys. Many years later, an old shepherd, Faustolinus, was wandering through the woods looking for a lost sheep, when he heard a snuffling and a growling, and he saw the grey shadows moving in the woods, and his heart began to race, for although he had never been attacked by a wolf and never knew anyone who had been attacked by a wolf, it was always better to be cautious. The wolves ran with incredible speed, less fast with the 2 lumbering pinkish figures that emerged from the shadows, that emerged from the bushes. Wild long hair, great long nails, great long claws upon their feet, covered in mud, snapping and snarling and growling at him like little wolf cubs. Here were 2 young lads, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. It was hard to tell, they were so grimy, and at once he realised these were feral boys. He'd heard ancient tales of children raised by wild animals, and here they were before him. Well, with something of a struggle, because they fought and they snapped and they snarled and they tried to bite him, he took one child under one arm and another child under the other arm and walked all of the way home, leaving his sheep to its fate, perhaps to end up as dinner for the wolf pack in exchange for the loss of 2 of their members. Well, his wife, who had long since wanted children, but whether it was her biology or his, they'd never been able to have them, took these 2 wild, muddy, snapping, snarling, tangle-haired children to her bosom. She scrubbed them, she cleaned them, she trimmed their hair, she cut their nails, she taught them to be human. And it was a struggle, as you might imagine, year after year after year, trying to get them to speak Latin instead of woofing and snapping and snarling and growling, trying to get them to eat cooked meat instead of raw, trying to get them to drink from cups instead of lapping from puddles and from rivers. But slowly, with love and compassion and tenderness, they transformed these 2 wild boys into 2 strange young men. For although they did learn to speak as humans, dress as humans. They never entirely learnt to act as humans. Their soul was always a wolf soul. Their gestures, their mannerisms, their movements owed more to the grey shadows of the forest than to the civilised manners of a Roman court. When they were on the verge of manhood, Faustulus was summoned to a long-distant villa to trade some sheep in exchange for olives and for urns of wine. And off he went, taking his two strong young sons with him to help guide the sheep and carry back the olives and the wine, thinking no more of it. And they arrived at the gates and were surprised to see the heavily armed soldiers vetting them to ensure that they really were just farmers trading. And when the guards were assured that this is all that they were allowed in. And they went up to the great house, to the villa, and there came out the old farmer with a couple of his servants to help him. And the farmer, at once all smiles and greetings, stopped still and dead when his eyes fell upon those two young lads and said, You are the spitting image of myself as a young man, of my brother as a young man. It's like seeing history replayed. And they sat, and over bread and wine and olive oil, they talked and they talked and they talked, and Faustulus explained the story of how he had found these two young lads, wild and rabid in the forest. And they worked out the dates. And old Numitor, even on his far distant farm, gossip had reached him that his daughter had had children, and these children had been thrown into the river. They put two and two together, and they realised, and old Faustulus, his heart heavy, that he knew this was the blood kin with the greater claim. Relinquished Romulus and Remus, for such he had called them, into the care of old Numitor. But Numitor said, You cannot stay here, otherwise rumour will reach my brother and he will come and have you killed. You must go back to your shepherding life. In due course, something can be done. I don't know what. Let me think on it, let me plan, let me come up with a strategy, but we will do something so that you will inherit the throne, for I am far too old to be bothered with politics anymore. And the two young men and the old shepherd went back to their shepherding life. Or at least the shepherd went back to his shepherding life. For the day they arrived back at the shepherd's hut, the two young men, Romulus and Remus, went off for a walk in the woods. And they did not come home that night, at least not until the very, very, very early hours of the morning. And news reached old Faustulus some days later that King Amulius, in the very night when Romulus and Remus had gone walking in the woods, had gone to sleep in his chamber, as usual. He slept alone. There were guards placed outside the chamber, for a man of Amulius's temperament makes enemies. All of that conquest cannot but make enemies. And those guards, even afterwards, when they were interrogated and put to the torture, saw nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing, could offer absolutely no explanation for how some invisible shadow had slipped past them, had entered into the bedchamber of Amulius, had perhaps strangled him at first, but then ripped him limb from limb, casting blood and entrails all around the room, had left almost animal-like footprints, but almost human-like at the same time, not quite one and not quite the other, all over the chamber, and then disappeared out through the window, for that was where the footprints led. None of the guards outside the great palace could offer an explanation, even after they were tortured, as to how the owners of these feet had passed by them unseen, unheard, unnoticed. Not indeed until the servant bringing the breakfast in the morning had found Amulius's wretched corpse did anyone know he had died in the night. Well, with Amulius gone, The kingdom was in disarray, enemies at the gate baying for the blood of the people of what had once been a mere humble agricultural village. The courtiers, the advisors, panicked. Who could we turn to? Who is the true owner of the throne? Who could take charge? There are a dozen generals who will rip the kingdom to shreds in competitive fights to see which one of them should take the throne. But one of the wise ones said, why not go and get old Numitor back? He is the blood kin. He is the rightful king. He is an old man. He perhaps will not be around for very much longer, but we should get him back to gain some peace until a resolution can be found. And so old Numitor was brought out of his house arrest, installed back upon the throne of a much, much bigger kingdom than the one he had originally had. And he at once announced that he had 2 grandchildren. He had his daughter Ria Silvia brought out from the Temple of the Vestal Virgins and reinstalled in the palace, and reunited with the 2 boys that dwelt still with the shepherds in the woods, who were richly rewarded for their kindness. Romulus and Remus came to the court, and those generals who had vied and blustered and bluffed that they should take the throne in due course when old Numitor popped his clogs. Well, they saw Romulus and they saw Remus, and though they were young, they could see there was something in the eyes, something wild, something dangerous, something lupine. And they backed down from their claims. And so the city grew and grew, peaceful for a few years, until old Numitor died in his bed happy and content, and the throne passed jointly to his 2 grandchildren. And Romulus and Remus ruled that city for many a long year, until they in their turn had a great falling out. They fought and they battled and they turned one upon the other, not with swords or daggers or axes, but with teeth and nails, with feet and fists, biting and scratching and ripping and tearing, until finally Romulus, in a fit of rage, had Remus dead upon the floor before him. And in seeing the death of his brother, Romulus threw back his head and howled like a savage beast, howled with grief as much as with triumph. And that is why the great city is named Rome, after Romulus, and not Reims after Remus, which is also how the city of Reims in France gets its name. It is said that to appease the unhappy ghost of his murdered brother for the kinslaying that had been so long delayed had come to fruition, every year at the feast of the angry ghost, at the feast of the Marnes, Romulus would offer black beans, the favourite food of his long-dead brother, to the ghost with apologies and requests for forgiveness. And so from that day to this, not only did the young men of Rome celebrate the feast of the Lupercalia, when the boys had washed up on the shore and been found by the wolves on the 15th of February, but they would also celebrate the feast of the angry ghosts and continue giving black beans to the wrathful dead, even though they could hardly remember why they had given black beans in the first place. But that is the end of this tale, and happy Lupercalia to you.